So I'll close with some poems from my most recent book, The Jaguar, which also gives this book its name. And this book is in part, not totally, but in part a book of elegies from my father, who had Parkinson's for the better part of 20 years. And so the poems were long in the thinking and short, relatively short in the writing in the end. It took me a long time to find my way to work out how to deal with this material in poetry. And part of that thinking, I think, was that elegies are sort of a well-worn path. You know, it's a very well-established poetic form. There are many tropes and cliches of elegy. And I was trying to think how I might work within that, but also expand that sense of that genre. And one of the sort of ways I answered that question for myself, to return to something I sort of spoke about a little earlier, was this idea of the human as animal. And so many of these elegies bring in animal imagery to describe human frailty, human mortality, and see the human as a kind of animal in these otherwise very sterile environments in which we often spend our final years, in hospital, in aged care homes. There was something to me extremely poignant about the sort of animal nature of the human animal, my father, in these very sterile kind of environments. So I'll read the opening poem to the book, which is called My Father as a Giant Koi, which sits sort of broadly in that genre of elegies that are working with human as animal. My father is a giant koi. My father is at the bottom of a pond, perfecting the art of the circle. He is guiding the mottled zeppelin of his body in a single unceasing turn, like a monorail running on greased steel, like an ice skater swerving on a blade. His scales are lava and ember, dappled with carbon. His tail a luxurious Japanese fan. He is so far beneath the green skin of duckweed, he cannot make me out or I him. What he knows is shrinking into round facts, days like mossed stones, each the same weight, spears of water hyacinth rising around him like jail bars, reek of peat. He has been down there for years, ancient god of the dark, keeper of the single koan, moving in currents only he can sense, fluent as a windsock. He surfaces 3 times a day, when the nurse brings a tray, cold blanched carrot and beef, white sauce fillet of whiting, pound cake. He cannot trust the scratched headlamps of his eyes, so he navigates by feel, angling his huge whiskered head, mouth first towards the fork, weaving like an adder, charmed by smoke. Then he bites down to find the world suddenly there again, solid as metal and bait. So one of the things that was quite surprising about my father's Parkinson's to me, I think when I had heard of Parkinson's and thought of Parkinson's, the main symptoms that come to mind are difficulty with your gait, difficulty with mobility, tremor, those kinds of things. And indeed, my father had those symptoms. But there's another sort of world of symptoms relating to someone's personality, to who they are, which can affect people with Parkinson's too. And so it was with my father. Dad had been an emotionally reserved kind of man up until his Parkinson's. And then he experienced something which is known in medical literature as pathological crying, which is this sort of phenomenon of someone crying when they're not even aware that they're crying, making themselves cry in conversation when you might be talking about very ordinary things. And so watching my father all of a sudden cry in this way was something quite extraordinary and kind of a spectacle, the likes of which I'd really never seen my father cry before. And then all of a sudden he was crying so fluently. And there was one subject that would reliably make my father cry. It didn't come up very often in conversation, but he would bring it up. When we weren't talking about it, he would find ways inevitably to talk about Winston Churchill. And Churchill, of course, was a big big figure in my father's life. Dad lost his own father during World War II. My father was English, so Churchill was a sort of towering figure to men of that generation. And for whatever reason, his mind got into a little neural loop related to Winston Churchill, and he would constantly bring him up and then immediately cry. So this poem takes its title from a line that Churchill said in a speech at Harvard, where he said, "The empires of the future are the empires of the mind." Empires of mind. Beside the fountain's troop of sun-bleached rubber ducks, in the gardens, under a shade sail, my father is crying about Winston Churchill. Midway through a lunch of cremated schnitzel, spoon-fed by the carer with the port wine stain, my father is crying about Winston Churchill. In the night, he cries out for Winston Churchill. During his morning bath, he cries for Winston Churchill. When the nurse does up his buttons, he will not stop his weeping. When the therapist wheels him to Tuesday piano, my father ignores the Mozart and cries for Winston Churchill. He cries not like a child seeking absolution, not like the mourner or the mourned, but free and unconstrained, as one who has spent a long time denying an urge and is suddenly giddy and incontinent in his liberation. The cleaners are unmoved. The woman who brings his hourly cup of pills is bright as a firework and goes about her round with the hardness of one who has heard all the crying in the world and finds in that reservoir nothing more disturbing than a tap's dripping drumbeat in a sink. But the night supervisor is frightened in the early hours when the halls ping with the sharp beep of motion sensors and my father's crying. His longing for silence is fierce and keen as a pregnant woman's craving for salt and fried chicken, as my father's crying for Winston Churchill. And the women in their beds call for it to stop like a Greek chorus, croaking like bullfrogs, each to each in the dark, unsettled, loud, insatiable, the unutterable fear rippling through them like a herd of horses, apprehending the tremor of thunder on a horizon they cannot see but feel. Another of the strange symptoms that my father experienced with his Parkinson's, which apparently is a common symptom for many Parkinson's sufferers, was compulsive spending. So there are some really terrible stories of people losing their entire life savings, gambling away their money. With my father, it was nothing quite so extreme as that, but he did remain able to buy things, and he did indeed buy things quite late into his Parkinson's. So 15 years after diagnosis, he was still perfectly competent in using the internet and buying what he wanted on there. And around the time that my mother and I had the conversation with my father that it might be time to consider giving up his driver's license, which was a very, very difficult conversation, my father decided to rebel by not telling anyone, not discussing it, no conversation whatsoever, but decided to buy himself a vintage Jaguar car on eBay, sight unseen. And the first we knew of this car was when it was delivered to our house on the back of a semi-trailer. The Jaguar. It shone like an insect in the driveway. Iridescent emerald, out-of-season Christmas beetle. Metallic flecks in the paint like riverbed tailings, squeaking doe-skin seats. Bottle green, my father called it, or else forest. A folly he bought without test driving, vintage 1980 XJ, a rebellion against his tremor. The sole bidder, he won the auction without trying, the day after the doctor told him to draw a line under his driving years. My mother didn't speak for weeks. It gleamed on the terracotta drive, wildcat forever lunging on the hood, predatory, the chrome snagging in the sun. Ornament of my father's madness, miraculous and sleek. Until he started to tinker, painted the leather seats with acrylic so they peeled and cracked, jacked the gear stick, hacked a hole into the dash with a Stanley knife, jury-rigged the driver's seat so it sat so low you couldn't see over the dash. For months he drove it, even though my mother begged. He drove it as though he was punishing her, dangerously fast on the back roads, then open up the engine on the highway, full throttle, even though he was going blind in one eye, even though my mother and I refused to get in. And for the first time in years, my father was happy. He was happy to be driving. He was happy my mother and I were miserable. Finally, his modifications killed it, the car he always wanted and waited so long to buy. And it sat like a carcass in the garage, like a headstone, like a coffin. But it's no symbol or metaphor. I can't make anything of it. So this next poem I'm going to read is set in hospital in the week that it took my father to die. And anyone who has sat beside the bedside of a loved one knows time is very elastic, very flexible in that space. It sort of simultaneously feels like it's rushing ahead, and also that it's tedious and slow in the extreme. So this poem is called Time Remaining. Like rolled beads of mercury, silver bubbles fly up silently in the mineral water by my father's bed. A bag of Hartmann's solution hangs in the air like a sling of trapped rain. A chartreuse teardrop blinks on the infusion pump's screen. The gauge reads, time remaining. In this void of time in which my father remains, I want to say is remaining, present continuous, he returns to me. Hello, sweetheart, he says blurrily. I'm just trying to get the damn thing working. And as if I can see what he's seeing, I ask, is it plugged in? He says, I'm beginning to wonder. And he's gone again, eyes swivelling through the morphine, rolling in the mulberry velvet of it. And I can see it's true. My father is beginning to wonder. He is at the verge of something he is only starting to comprehend the shape of, as if he's standing at the delta of a huge muddy river mouth where the mackerel-backed sky and water mirror each other's enormities, and the eye cannot find the horizon between them, a demarcation known only to those who wade in, full immersion. It is right that at the end of his life, my father's final feeling is wonder, not awe, not joy, but wonder, cousin of astonishment and doubt, which in the Old English also means to magnify, the way his time remaining dilates and shrinks, is made both infinitesimally small and infinite, a day, an hour, a minute. And the final poem that I'll read, which is a sort of shorter poem, short elegy called The Outing. You kept your clothing divided into round the house and going out. After you could do neither, your wardrobe still upheld your order, a museum piece preserving old exigencies. Wool Pierre Cardin suits to the left, grey track pants to the right. Before you died, the mortician asked for an outfit for your cremation. In their right place, I found your best navy slacks, furzed with mildew, so long since their last outing. I washed them, how could I not, held them hot to my cheek, ghosting of chamomile detergent, pressed them crisp with your favourite gingham shirt, still sharp after 20 years. I know you'd insist they be just so, faultless. After a week, broiling in your own skin, sliding delirious in a paper gown under Arctic air conditioning, in the end you'll be dressed as a man again, someone with somewhere, finally, to go. Thank you.